Good morning from the San Francisco Bay Area, or good afternoon or evening to you, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Roland Green, director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and I want to welcome you to our second event in a new online series called Inside the Center. We conceived the series to feature the work of current and recent fellows at the Humanities Center. We want to show some of the provocative, unusual, cutting-edge work that takes place in the building you see behind me. We're going to talk about how exciting intellectual work is made in history, music, philosophy, literature, and the other disciplines of the humanities. We'll invite our fellows to explain what counts as evidence in their fields, why one interpretation is better than another, and what makes an argument tick. If you're among the general public, we welcome you warmly to our center and hope you will want to join us from time to time. And if you are a former fellow, a Stanford alum, or a member of our humanities community, welcome back. This is our 40th anniversary year, a milestone that prompts us to look back at our history, but especially forward at our future. And we believe that a part of that future will be events like this, in which for the first time in that 40-year history, we can gather our friends and supporters worldwide. Let me mention a detail or two. The session is being recorded and will be available on our website. So please feel free to invite others to join us in their own time. And because the webinar format can make the viewer feel that one is the only person watching, I'm going to make a point of announcing the size of the crowd. For those of you who have been to our building on the Stanford campus and remember our large lecture hall, which holds well over 100 people, today's audience has that room at capacity. Our speaker today is Geraldo Cadava, who will discuss his new book, The Hispanic Republican: The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump. This timely book, which Jerry completed during his fellowship term at the Humanities Center this past year, explains the complicated relationship between Hispanics or Latinos, who are of course not one group of people, but Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Central Americans, among other identities, and the Republican Party since Richard Nixon. Professor Cadava, Jerry, will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll entertain questions until the end of our time together, which will be about 12 noon Pacific time. Jerry, this past year, was the sort of fellow that everyone enjoys having among our community at the Humanities Center, not only because he's a rising historian, but because of his insights as a political commentator. You might have heard him this week on MSNBC, and you can read his op-ed later today in the New York Times. In normal times, all of the fellows have lunch together every weekday at the Humanities Center, and with Jerry, one could always expect an informed, sharp take on whatever was in the political news of the moment. Geraldo Cadava is Associate Professor of History at Northwestern University. He is the author of Standing on Common Ground: The Making of a Sunbelt Borderland, a book which appeared in 2016, a study of how the area around Nogales, Sonora, and Tucson, Arizona, neighboring Mexican and American cities, was formed through cultural and commercial exchange. Now, just before we begin, if you want to submit a question during the webinar, click the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your Zoom screen to type your question. We will try to get to all of the questions after the talk, but if we don't manage to do that, we will certainly try to answer them after the event. Jerry, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Please take it away.
Thanks so much for having me, Roland. And thank you everyone at the Humanities Center for inviting me to participate in this new Inside the Center series. It's great to be involved with the center again. So I yearn more than ever for your company. I yearn for any company these days, but especially yours. I was thinking today that it was exactly 1 year ago today that my family moved into our Airbnb house in Menlo Park, full of optimism for the year ahead. And until March, the year really exceeded our expectations. I made new friends, reconnected with old ones. I learned so much from everyone I met. Our family loved living in California, and I had the time and space to get a lot of work done. Even after March, when things shut down, the center did everything it could to nurture our camaraderie, making a truly difficult situation just a little less bad. So thank you so much to all of my friends at the Humanities Center. I really appreciate it. Despite it all, I did manage to finish my book that I'll tell you about today. I even sunk my teeth into a new project, which was in many ways inspired by this one. The book I completed is called The Hispanic Republican: The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump. And it was published at the very end of May. I'm going to share some slides with you. Let me do that quickly. This gentleman here in the picture is named Benjamin Fernandez, who was the first Hispanic to run for president in 1980 as a Republican in the primary that featured Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He's one of the main characters in my book. And here is a picture of the cover of the book. This is a gathering in 1983, just as Reagan started his re-election campaign. So the topic of the book is, of course, relevant to this year's election. Latinos are the second largest group of voters for the first time in history. And if you're paying attention to the conventions, you've already heard about the dangers of Fidel Castro's, Hugo Chavez's, Nicolas Maduro's socialism, as well as stories about immigrant opportunity, entrepreneurship, government control, and other topics that appeal to the 30% or so of Latino voters who I'm writing about, those who have consistently, since Richard Nixon's re-election in 1972, given their votes to the Republican Party. But even though it's relevant to this year's election, I'm going to stick closely in my talk anyway on my historical findings. And then at the very end of my talk, and even more in the discussion, we can point to the present and talk about the present. So I wanted to write this book about Hispanic Republicans to begin to fill in some gaps in our knowledge about Latinas and Latinos in the United States. And I tackled one big idea held by the general public and even many scholars, that Latinos are monolithic voters, monolithic political actors, that they're overwhelmingly Democrats, and stated more strongly that they are natural Democrats, and it's almost inconceivable that they could be anything but. And I don't think Latinos are naturally anything. I think their diverse political identities are a product of history. To me, a natural identity suggests that people are born a certain way instead of being formed over a period of decades because of their family ties, because of their relationships within the community, because of their developed sense of what's right and wrong in the world. So I don't think there's anything natural about political identity. To be clear, most Hispanics do vote for Democrats. And I should say always, right out front, that the reason I'm using the term Hispanic instead of Latino is that that is the preferred term of Hispanic conservatives, especially during the historical period I'm talking about in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Today, the Latinos for Trump group is called Latinos for Trump, but that's a fairly new term. Usually it's Hispanic. So that's why I'm using the term. So most Hispanics do vote for Democrats. About 2/3 of them, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, have voted for the Democratic presidential candidate since the days of Richard Nixon in the late 60s and early 70s. But this also means that almost 1/3 of Hispanics, who amount to millions of voters every election, have been ignored. Media coverage, I don't think, has helped us understand these voters. After elections, articles report that the Democrat, quote, crushed the Republican, or that they won in a, quote, landslide. But then they leave it at that. And to the extent that media tries to explain Latino support for Republicans, they focus on particular issues like abortion, Catholicism, military service, wealth, and even skin color or age cohort. I also think that political scientists haven't entirely helped us understand Hispanic Republicans. They might acknowledge that some Hispanics and Latinos are Republicans, but they've focused on the supermajority who are liberal, with the result that they too ignore the millions who are conservative. They argue that liberalism is a core part of Latino identity based on attitude surveys, finding that a majority of Hispanics and Latinos support government intervention in the economy, for example, or that they favor comprehensive immigration reform, including a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. The one finding that usually lends credence to the idea that Hispanics and Latinos are conservative, they note, is the aversion of Hispanics and Latinos to welfare and other so-called entitlement programs. And by limiting the conversation to these particular issues, I think that both the media and political scientists are missing a bigger picture. First, I don't think that any single issue or national group can explain why Hispanics have identified as Republicans. Attitude surveys, which find that a certain percentage of Hispanics support X, while a certain percentage supports Y, and then from those findings make inferences that Hispanics are conservative or liberal based on such findings, can be misleading. To take just one example, religion cuts in many different directions. Certain aspects of the Catholic tradition can be seen as conservative, such as opposition to abortion, while others can be seen as liberal, including a strong Latin American tradition of liberation theology. Moreover, while there's still a greater number of Hispanics who are Catholic, the fastest growing religion among them is evangelical Christianity. And evangelicals themselves aren't even monolithically conservative. It's a faith that many immigrants practiced in Latin America and then brought with them to the United States, with the result that the Latino evangelical vote gets split between Republicans and Democrats. But it's certainly the case that Latino evangelicals vote for Republicans at a higher rate than Latinos in general, which is why Republicans pay so much attention to recruiting them. All of this goes to show that I've taken one issue to show how it's more complicated than we assume and how you can't chalk up partisan identity to a particular issue like religion or Catholicism in particular. Nor do I think that you can chalk it up to a particular national background. So it's long been assumed that Cubans are the Hispanic Republicans par excellence. When I interviewed many California-based Mexican Americans who were active in the Republican Party from the 1960s forward, they kind of scoffed at the idea that it was all about Cubans. And one of them told me that Cuban Americans, quote, didn't really matter until 1980, when Ronald Reagan brought them into the conservative movement. Before then, many Cubans were still focused on overthrowing Castro and returning to the island. And as a result, they didn't naturalize in large numbers. Most who did naturalize and voted were as likely to support Democrats as Republicans. Jimmy Carter, for example, in 1966 won the Cuban vote, in 1976, I'm sorry, in his campaign against Gerald Ford, won the Cuban vote in Florida. That only shifted in 1980 with Reagan, and even more so with the establishment by Jorge Mas Canosa of the Cuban American National Foundation in 1981. In other words, it wasn't only about Cubans, it was also, and in many ways primarily in the early years, about Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans who launched and grew the Hispanic movement in the Southwest and New York. So these are just two examples, this idea that Hispanic conservatives and Hispanic conservatism is about Catholicism or Cuban exile politics that I'm trying to complicate in my book by saying it's much broader and deeper. You can't point to single issues or a singular national group. And I think that journalists and political scientists have also missed how partisan loyalty to the Republican Party has developed over the past 2 generations, from the 1950s forward. And this is the big picture I'm trying to bring into view by moving away from particular focuses on particular moments like the Cuban Revolution or particular national groups and particular issues. So on to my book. My book tries to illustrate these big arguments I've just been articulating in 4 parts. The first part is called Awakening, and it's about the period when Hispanics began moving toward the Republican Party. Part 2 is about inclusion and influence, when Richard Nixon in particular made a greater effort than any Republican presidential candidate before him to include Hispanics as part of the Republican coalition. The third section is called Doubt, and it's about a period in the late 70s, early 80s, and into the 1990s when Hispanics were simultaneously included in the Republican Party more than ever before, but at the same time harbored doubts about whether either party was truly committed to their full incorporation. And then the last section, which covers the period from the early 1990s to the present, is really about how Hispanic Republicans were dismayed with the party's rightward turn on immigration and its failure to achieve other goals like the overthrow of Castro or statehood for Puerto Rico. But they never abandoned the Republican Party. And I think we're still in this moment today, and it's critical to understanding how Donald Trump in 2016 and perhaps even this year won about the usual expected 30% about. So I began the book in the 1950s. Dwight Eisenhower was the first Republican president that Hispanics rallied around in any way. It didn't happen in the 1950s as part of a national movement, but it was the result of the efforts of particular activists in the Southwest, and especially in California. Hispanics had become more politically active as a result of World War II, and as many have noted, veterans and others began to demand individual and collective rights. Veterans in particular identified with Eisenhower because they saw him as their general. He was the military leader that most helped the United States win World War II, and with the post-war reconstruction efforts in Europe. And he would be the Cold War leader that the country needed. But as much as Hispanics began to move toward the Republican Party, the party, and both parties actually, also began to move toward them. And this happened in the 1950s for 2 reasons. First, as the population of the Sun Belt exploded after World War II from the Southeast to the Southwest, so did politicians' attentions to the region. So in 1950, New York still had the largest number of electoral votes in the United States. But as the populations of states like California and Texas and Florida grew, they achieved greater electoral importance. And these were also the states that had the largest Hispanic populations in the country. Second, as the Cold War in the Americas heated up in Puerto Rico and Mexico and Guatemala and Uruguay and Cuba and elsewhere, politicians really began to see Hispanics as important brokers who, through their business and political connections in Latin America, could help the United States achieve its foreign policy objectives in the region. So this is why it started in the 1950s. After they supported Dwight Eisenhower, Hispanic Republicans supported Barry Goldwater during his 1964 campaign. Among other issues, Goldwater harped on the Kennedy administration's failure at the Bay of Pigs, which marked the very beginning of a long turning away of Cubans from the Democratic Party. Cubans at first liked Kennedy, but then came to see him as a traitor after he refused to send military backup to the Cuban exiles who led the 1961 invasion. Seizing the opportunity that was afforded by their criticism, Goldwater began to make inroads with Cubans in Florida and all along the eastern seaboard. And he also drew support from Mexican Americans in the Southwest, especially in his native Arizona and California. But to be clear, Eisenhower's 8 years in office and Goldwater's failed campaign in 1964 were early moments in this mutual embrace between Hispanics and the Republican Party. The Hispanic Republican movement began in earnest during Richard Nixon's first term in office. Before then, Republican presidential candidates customarily won 5 to 10% of the Hispanic vote. But in 1972, that shifted dramatically when Nixon won more than 30% of the Hispanic vote. He was the first Republican to ever do so, but in many ways, he set the bar for all Republicans after him. As historians who've written about this period have made clear, Nixon's first term, beginning in 1969, was not going well. There was the war in Vietnam, campus protests nationwide, prison riots. So Nixon set out to both undermine his enemies and recruit new supporters. The effort to undermine his enemies led to the Watergate, of course, and his effort to recruit new supporters led him to recruit Hispanic voters. At the same time, between 1968 and 1972, Republican strategists realized that the Republican Party needed Hispanics since African Americans were leaving the party in great numbers. This process began especially after Barry Goldwater, pictured here, did not support the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Republican strategists were very explicit about this. They said in letters back and forth to one another that they really needed Hispanics because they needed to make up for the African American votes that they were losing. So Nixon had several strategies to recruit Hispanic voters. He established what's called the Cabinet Committee on Opportunities for Spanish-Speaking Peoples. And what this committee did was it gathered the heads of all of the agencies that dealt with so-called Hispanic issues like the Labor Department, the Agriculture Department, the Health, Education, and Welfare Department, etc. And they were to focus attention primarily on increasing federal employment opportunities for Hispanics. This led some Hispanic Republicans to oppose Nixon because instead of seeing him as a true conservative, they saw him as, quote, the father of the quota system, which anticipates the language of the Republican backlash against affirmative action. And the idea that Nixon was the father of the quota system, this is Linda Chavez talking, who served in the Reagan administration, was nominated to serve in the George W. Bush administration. Nixon also sought Hispanic support by making several high-level appointments, including Romana Acosta Bañuelos as the first Hispanic treasurer of the United States. Here's a picture of Nixon and Bañuelos in the Oval Office on the occasion of her nomination. But he also appointed Hilario Sandoval as the head of the Small Business Administration, and Benjamin Fernandez, whose picture you saw at the very beginning of the slide presentation. He was, before he was a candidate for president, the head of the National Economic Development Agency, or NEDA, N-E-D-A. So Bañuelos, in fact, I love this fact about the Hispanic Republican movement. She was the first of the Republican Party's tradition of appointing female Hispanics to the post of Treasurer of the United States, and this continues today. There was Catherine Ortega under Reagan, Catalina Vázquez Villalpando under George H.W. Bush, Rosario Marin under George W. Bush. Today, Jovita Carranza is not the treasurer, but she's now the head of the Small Business Administration. I just love the image of in the 1970s and 1980s, if you were walking around with American currency in your wallets or billfolds or purses, you were carrying with you the signature of a Mexican-American Republican treasurer of the United States. The idea behind these high-level appointments was that they signaled to Hispanics across the country that the Nixon administration cared about them, and that they could become key surrogates for Nixon on the campaign trail. And this is in fact what they did. And they received lots of credit after Nixon's landslide re-election in 1972 for helping him win the election. For the rest of the 1970s, and really into the 1980s too, Republicans tried to duplicate Nixon's success among Hispanics. They started to build out the party infrastructure, especially with the establishment of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly in 1974. This became the official auxiliary of the Republican National Committee, which was headed by George H.W. Bush in the early 1970s. And the first national chairman of the RNHA, as it became known, was Ben Fernandez, who had served in the Nixon administration. And so you can begin kind of tracking his evolution and how his power within the Hispanic Republican movement grew. He was the head of the National Economic Development Agency, the head of the Republican National Assembly, Republican National Hispanic Assembly, and then by the late 70s, he's running for president, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. And the Republican National Hispanic Assembly kind of quickly became a bullpen for the Republican Party, and if you want to think of it this way, cultivating Hispanic Republican talent, and it was the pool from which Republican presidents drew when they wanted to make Hispanic appointments. So in many ways, this group, the Republican National Hispanic Assembly, became the power broker for Hispanic Republican politics. Ford very much courted their endorsement in 1976. Ford himself didn't do particularly well among Hispanics, and he lost the election to Carter, but his administration had some key legacies for the history of the Hispanic Republican movement, including recognition of the RNHA as a key influencer of Hispanics, the appointment of the first special assistant to the President of the United States for Hispanic affairs. This was the New Mexican Fernando de Baca. And he signed the 1975 amendment to the Voting Rights Act, which mandated the publication of election materials in Spanish as well as English in communities with significant or sizable Hispanic populations. This increased Hispanic political participation, and it was championed by a Republican president. One of my favorite stories from the book is this Great Tamale incident, which many political observers believed was at least partially responsible for Ford's loss in the Republican primary to Reagan in 1976, and his loss in Texas in the general election against Jimmy Carter in the fall. And what happened is that he was visiting San Antonio. This picture is taken at the Alamo, I think in April 1976, and he's given a tamale, and he forgets to take the shuck off of the tamale before biting into it. So as newspapers describe it, he had a kind of grimacing, awkward expression on his face when he bit into a tamal. And because the San Antonio Express News captured this moment as a photograph, it circulated throughout Texas, and it was seen as a sign of cultural insensitivity that ultimately doomed Gerald Ford, both in Texas and in the national election, because if he had won Texas's electoral votes, he would have won the election against Jimmy Carter. So Hispanic Republicans afterwards call it the great disaster of 1976, just because Ford bit into a tamal. And I think it also just played into larger narratives about Ford's clumsiness and aloofness. So the national head of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly, Fernandez, he was called Boxcar Ben. This is his nickname, Boxcar Ben, because he was born in a railroad boxcar. And as I mentioned, he became the first Hispanic to run for president of the United States in 1978. And he declared his candidacy in November 1978, which was just the same month that Time magazine ran a cover story that said Hispanics, or the 1980s, would be the decade of the Hispanic because of their rising political power, their growing population, and its other things. So it was called the decade of the Hispanic. It was pointing forward to this moment when the political and cultural power and influence of Hispanics within the United States was going to rise. And this was the beginning of the idea, really, that Hispanics were a sleeping giant that was about to wake up. Here's a picture of Fernandez and his wife, Jackie, ordering ice cream in Latin America in 1977 as one of his it wasn't even his campaign yet because he hadn't declared his candidacy, but it was almost like a stunt to take a tour throughout Latin America. And he had a dinner at Anastasio Somoza's house in Nicaragua and traveled throughout the hemisphere to try to demonstrate his US Latin American relations chops, and that his idea really when he ran against Carter was that the nation needed a Hispanic, someone who could speak Spanish. He was also an economist, and we needed to bring the nation back from the doldrums of the 1970s. So this was his strategy, and part of the way he tried to bolster his reputation was by traveling through Latin America to meet with leaders there, and he was going to be seen as the candidate that would really improve US Latin American relations. And his whole campaign was in many ways based on Hispanic momentum. Hispanics were going to be his base. And he had a really unique electoral strategy. He was going to skip out on the Iowa and New Hampshire primaries. And still to this day, that's the kind of path that candidates try to blaze. They do well in Iowa and New Hampshire and try to gain momentum heading into other states. But 1980 was also the first year that the island of Puerto Rico was going to participate in the Republican primary process. So the Puerto Rico primary in 1980 actually took place before the Iowa and New Hampshire primaries. So Ben Fernandez developed this whole electoral theory that he was going to win the Puerto Rico primary with the support of his co-ethnic Puerto Rican Spanish-speaking primary voters. And then nationally, like in the mainland, pundits would start to take attention or take notice of him by saying like, hey, this guy won the Puerto Rico primary, we should take a look at him. And that would give him momentum heading into Iowa and New Hampshire. He would be off to the races, as he put it. They would watch his smoke after he won in Puerto Rico. This didn't even come close to happening. He came in third place with less than 1% of the vote in Puerto Rico. He was well behind George H.W. Bush, who won the primary with 60% of the vote, and Howard Baker, the senator from Tennessee, who won some 35%. Reagan actually didn't even participate in the 1980 primary in Puerto Rico. So as it turns out, why did George H.W. Bush win such a sizable percentage of the vote in Puerto Rico? A lot of it had to do with his son Jeb, who had just turned 27, and he was really critical to his father's success in Puerto Rico. He studied abroad in Mexico. This is Jeb that we're talking about. He studied abroad in Mexico when he was in high school at Andover. He met his future wife, Columba Garnica de Gallo, on that trip. He majored in Latin American studies at UT Austin, and then worked at a Venezuelan bank after college. So what he did in Puerto Rico, he essentially camped out in Puerto Rico for months before the primary there. And it was funny, when I was doing a lot of my interviews for this book, I talked to different political figures in Puerto Rico who had different accounts of what Jeb Bush was doing during those months. Some said that he pitched a tent in a public park and slept there. One remembered, offering his apartment to Jeb for Jeb to camp out there. The point is that everyone remembered that Jeb was kind of centrally involved in his father's campaign in Puerto Rico in 1980. So Bush, what was critical to his success beyond his son Jeb just kind of camping out in Puerto Rico in the months before the primary, was that his father, George H.W. Bush, supported the one issue that mattered to them, which was statehood, making Puerto Rico the 51st state of the United States. And for Jeb, this was just the very beginning of his popularity among Latinos, which was critical to him throughout his time as the governor of Florida and as a candidate for president in 2016. Here's a picture of Columba giving a speech in Puerto Rico during the primary process. Jeb, at the age of 27, is in the middle there. George H.W. Bush seated with his legs crossed. To the right, to our right, to George H.W. Bush's left, is a woman named Julia Rivera de Vicente, who's a kind of shaker and mover, a mover and shaker in Puerto Rico politics. So as we know about 1980, Reagan eventually won the nomination and then selected Bush as his running mate. And it was Reagan, he kind of made several advances in recruiting Hispanic voters. He was the first presidential candidate from either party to really launch a coordinated media campaign that targeted Hispanics. And it was run by an advertising maven from San Antonio named Leonel Sosa. And Sosa had assistance from Reagan's Hispanic aides, people like Alex Armendariz and Fernando Oaxaca. Both of them were also leaders of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly. And they were also the heads of their own Hispanic media and public relations firms. Reagan made another key innovation in recruiting Hispanics. He moved away from the patronage politics that defined Nixon's and Ford's efforts. And by patronage, I mean like efforts to create more federal jobs for Hispanics or high-level appointments. And Reagan moved toward trying to articulate and identify the issues that made Hispanics, quote, natural Republicans, as he famously called them. There's a story about how he and Leonel Sosa, the advertising executive from San Antonio, I was just telling you about, they were talking during Reagan's campaign, and Reagan apparently told Leonel Sosa, who's the originator of this story, that, you know, Leonel, your job is going to be so easy. You're going to have the easiest job in the world because Hispanics are Republicans who just don't know it yet. This is the origins of this idea. So Reagan tried to move away from patronage politics and toward trying to articulate the ideas that were to bring Hispanic Republicans together. And these included family values, religion, anti-communism, and free market capitalism. Anti-communism and capitalism had been issues before, but Reagan's 1980 campaign was really the first time that they featured in Hispanic outreach. And as a result, Reagan won the customary 30% of the Hispanic vote, including from Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Central Americans, and a staggering 80% from Cuban Americans. Reagan could be just as polarizing for Hispanics as he was for other Americans. They liked his strident opposition to Castro, the fact that he had appointed Catherine Ortega and others, and that he advocated moderate border and immigration policies that were harsh, but not so harsh as what other Republicans wanted. He called Mexico on the campaign trail the most important ally of the United States. And he said that we didn't need a border wall that divided the two countries. But he was also seen as cold toward the interests of working class Hispanics in particular, and even Hispanic Republicans opposed the part of his immigration bill that called for employer sanctions, the idea that employers could be penalized for knowingly hiring undocumented immigrants. Hispanic Republicans largely saw Reagan as a president who continued the era of inclusion started under Nixon. They believed they were influential in the Reagan White House and that they had a seat at the table for important policy conversations. But they were also wary of rising nativism within the Republican Party, including growing movements to make English the official language of the United States and other things like the Zero Population Growth Movement or the Federation for American Immigration Reform. Hispanic Republicans appreciated the fact that Reagan remained dedicated to signing a comprehensive immigration reform bill, even though conflicts over the shape of the bill pushed its signing into his second term. Some Cuban Americans also began to express their frustration that despite Reagan's anti-communist bluster, Castro was still in power. And interestingly, the Iran-Contra scandal that plagued Reagan's second term wasn't a problem for Hispanic Republicans at all. Leaders such as New Mexico's Republican representative, Manuel Lujan, spoke for many when he vociferously supported Reagan's Central American policy, including the supply of arms. And in some ways, the Reagan years represented the pinnacle of the Hispanic Republican movement, by which I mean the time when Hispanic Republicans believed that through decades of work and organization, they had achieved inclusion within the Republican Party. George H.W. Bush capitalized on this in 1988 when he was elected again with the usual third of the Hispanic vote. He personally benefited from the support he had cultivated during his time as the head of the Republican National Committee and during his first run for president in 1980. And by the late 1980s, Jeb Bush had also become increasingly involved in South Florida's Hispanic political scene. He had served as Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Lettman's campaign advisor, and she became the first Cuban American to become elected to Congress. And Bush was also the first Republican to use a State of the Union speech as the occasion to call for Puerto Rican statehood, even though it had been included in the Republican Party platform since the 1940 election. So again, in the 1980s, the late 1980s, Hispanic Republicans felt momentum. But by the end of Bush's term, his first term and only term, and this is where I start to see the real shift toward loyalty and away from inclusion. So the beginning of a justification of their continued support for Republicans because they had developed a sense of loyalty to the party over decades. I really see that beginning during this period. By the end of Bush's first term, it was clear that the Republican Party was tacking to the right on immigration. Pat Buchanan challenged Bush in the 1992 primary, railing against the amnesty granted to more than 1 million undocumented immigrants as a result of the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. And as a columnist for the conservative Washington Times, he said it was foolish to consider introducing Puerto Rico as the 51st state of the Union, because it would be tantamount to incorporating a secessionist movement that he compared to the one in Quebec. He would incorporate the members of a state, 10% of whose population wanted to be independent from the United States. And it would also add hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans to the welfare rolls. Immigration was becoming an increasingly divisive issue in the states as well, with the majority support in California, as you all know well, for Proposition 187. And there were border restrictions like Operation Gatekeeper, which further militarized the border. And the anti-immigrant movement traveled from California to Washington, D.C. as Congress debated and then passed. And then a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, signed the Restrictive Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. The backlash by Hispanics against the party's rightward shift was so strong that Republicans nominated George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, who promised to restore humanity to the immigration and border debate. And Hispanic Republicans hoped, they really hoped, that candidates like George W. Bush, rather than like Buchanan, would define the future of the Republican Party. George W. Bush was promising a more compassionate conservatism, and he won 40 and 44% of the Hispanic vote as a result. But seen in perspective, I think, his success, George W. Bush's success, looks like a blip on the radar, an exception to the party's longer 25-year move to the right on immigration. Yet it's important to note that despite changes within the Republican Party, about 30% of Hispanics continue to vote for Republicans, including John McCain in 2008, Mitt Romney in 2012, and yes, Donald Trump in 2016. They've continued to support Republicans not only because their policy preferences on particular issues align with those of the Republican Party, but also because they've supported Republicans for more than half a century. Hispanic Republicans have become loyal to the party. Unlike African Americans, after Goldwater's embrace of the Southern strategy in the 1960s, Hispanics haven't abandoned the party en masse, and it doesn't appear that they're about to do so now. Thank you so much. I'm going to now pause and stop my screen share. This is the end of my PowerPoint presentation and my talk. And now I will join Roland for questions. Thank you again for listening.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I think I will appear next to you shortly.
Can't wait.
There we are. Here we come. Great. Thank you so much. There's so much to talk about. And let me try to respond to some of the issues that came up in the talk and also distill some of the questions that our audience members are asking you.
Yeah.
I want to start by asking you about the whole, and this is really fundamental to your whole book, the whole notion of the Latino vote. Why, to put it really plainly, why is there still such a thing as the Latino vote that is a useful category? You mentioned early on in the talk that this is the second largest voting group in I think in the current political scene. Why is this still a useful and even feasible term given the complexity of Latinos as a collectivity and the differences among them? And do you foresee a day when that term will stop being useful?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first part especially is, I think the second one is provocative and interesting and great. I think the first one is one that I've wrestled with throughout writing this project. I mean, one of the early challenges to the book was like, how can you talk about the Latino vote when there is no such thing as a Latino vote? It's a collection of individual national groups rather than a kind of monolith. And by monolith, I don't even mean like, I guess I'll just stick with a single population. So, you know, I don't think that there is a Latino vote, but I do think that there are, you know, 14 million Latinos who identify as such who will vote. I don't know that there's a Latino vote, but there are 14 million Latinos who will vote. And because they will represent more than 10% of the electorate this season, it's worth trying to explain their political behavior and trying to explain why they vote the way that they do. That's one answer. I think another answer is that, you know, I'm taking my historical actors at face value when they themselves are trying in the 1970s and 1980s to articulate a group identity. And they're struggling, but they are the ones in the 1970s who are trying to sit down and say, how are we going to appeal to members of all of these nationality groups to try to harness their political power? And that's why it's Reagan in the late 1970s who's saying it's about family values, it's about Catholicism, it's about entrepreneurship, anti-communism. So in some ways, it's an opposed identity. He's imposed identity. He's doing it in conversation with Hispanic aides like Alex Armendariz, Fernando Oaxaca. So, you know, the first answer is that no Latino vote, 14 million Latinos who do vote. The second answer is that historical actors themselves in the 70s and 80s are trying to articulate this group identity. And finally, I would just point to the fact that, you know, each Latino group, like Puerto Rican Republicans, has their own particular issue that they care most about and more about than other groups. So Puerto Ricans are always going to care about statehood more than Cubans do, or more than Mexican Americans do. Mexican Americans are always going to care about border and immigration policies more than Puerto Ricans do, who are citizens of the United States. Cuban Americans might always care about the US-Cuba relationship and anti-communism more. But I do think that in general, unless there's a particular issue that undermines the interests of another Latino nationality group, they are more than happy to support the issues lobbied for by the other groups. So, you know, you'll have heads of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly who are Mexican American or Cuban American going to Washington in the early 1990s testifying in support of statehood for Puerto Rico. Interestingly, NAFTA was one moment when there were divisions because Cuban Americans, for example, like an important part of NAFTA, well, in the early 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Mexico started giving an increased amount of aid to Cuba. And Cuban Americans were not interested at all in entering into a deal that would somehow benefit a country that was doing business with Cuba.
Right.
Similarly, Puerto Rico, companies in Puerto Rico have kind of a preferential tax agreement where they're able to produce goods with certain tax benefits to their companies. And so they were worried that NAFTA would kind of cut into their profits. So that was an issue where different groups came into conflict. But in general, I think the groups were happy to support each other's issues. And I guess I'll just end by saying, like, I don't know that we have to ever fully decide this. I think, you know, kind of keep the tension between the ideas is part of the answer, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. I want to come back to that actually about the kind of mutual support of different Latino groups. But before I do that, I want to also ask you something that's sort of top of the mind after hearing your, you know, very wide-ranging summary of a complicated book with a complicated argument. And that is to ask invite you to say a little bit more about how race and class shape Hispanic Republican identity.
Yeah. Oh boy, that's great. You know, I don't have a single answer for this, but I have lots of different answers. I mean, a lot of the individuals that I interviewed, well, you know, they told stories about their family's Spanish descent. So they weren't Afro-Latinos, they weren't indigenous. They didn't see themselves that way. They told stories about their family's descent from Spain, especially, well, not especially, I mean, this kind of cuts across all nationality groups. Mexican Americans in the Southwest talk a lot about their Spanish descent. They, you know, one Mexican American department store owner that I actually wrote about in my first book from Tucson, he, you know, ran a department store. He had the kind of largest collection in the Southwest of Spanish trinkets. There are paintings of him where he fashions himself as Don Quixote. There are, you know, those kinds of things. I'm sure, right. You know all about this stuff. Right. Puerto Ricans would talk about their families moved from Spain in the 1850s, and they were actually from the Basque country, you know, the one of the territories in Spain that was always fighting for its own independence as well. So they would tell stories about how, you know, that experience of migrating from Spain kind of almost bred in them the entrepreneurial spirit of independence. And that, you know, that has some kind of race and class dimensions to it.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, you know, there's one guy who I was really intrigued by named Henry Ramirez, who served in the Nixon White House. He called himself, he wrote a book called A Chicano in the White House, and he called himself a mestizo civil rights cold warrior. he rebelled against the idea that like, you know, everyone thought that Mexican American conservatives were like white wannabe sellouts. He saw himself as a proud civil rights warrior, and he called himself a mestizo and a Chicano. And that is generally very anathema to conservative Latinos, the idea that they would be called Chicanos or Boricuas or something like that in the case of Cubans, so, or in Puerto Ricans. So, you know, that kind of stuff intrigued me, and that's why it makes it hard to say something precise about race, because I do think people want to say that it's the Latinos with lighter skin, it's those who earn more who are more likely to be conservative. And there's some evidence to back that up, because it's been found that like Latinos who earn more than $75,000 a year are more likely to be conservative than those who earn less. There's some data for that, but there are always kind of contradictions. The last thing I'll say is when it comes to African Americans, you know, that's also a very thorny conversation. I mentioned a guy, Fernando de Baca, who was appointed by Ford as the special assistant to the President of the United States, the first special assistant, and he's given credit for really shepherding through the legislative process, the 1975 amendment to the Voting Rights Act. So he served in the Ford administration, but then in 2008, when Barack Obama was running, he got into trouble. He was at that point the chairman of either the New Mexico Republican Party or the Albuquerque Republican Party. And he said that Latinos won't vote for a Black president. This was around the same time that the Mexican president, Vicente Fox, said that Mexican immigrants do work that not even African Americans will do. You know, so it's a thorny issue. And now, even today, you know, after the George Floyd murder, there are lots of conversations about anti-Blackness among Latinos. So these are all elements of how race and class work together in this movement, but you would never ever hear Hispanic Republicans say, for the most part, out loud that they are racist. Of course not. But, you know, when it came to opposing African Americans during the civil rights movement, it was not about race. It was about how the Democratic Party was the party for African Americans because the Democrats catered to the needs of African Americans and didn't care about Hispanics. So it was an argument that drew a line between Hispanics and African Americans, but it was never articulated in terms of racially discriminatory terms. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot to say, but I don't know that there's something very precise to say in a kind of causal relationship that Latinos are conservative because of these things.
Well, thank you. That's insightful. I also want to continue what you just brought up, the kind of comparison with African American voters, because you glance at this in the talk and you mention it also in the book. You know, it's become axiomatic that African Americans abandoned the Republican Party around the time of the civil rights legislation in the mid-60s, when the Republicans, especially, as you say, and you have a slide about this, Barry Goldwater refused to support the Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. You know, there are also versions of this for Hispanics. Certainly you mentioned Proposition 187 in 1994, which, as you say, in a way went national because it migrated. You said something like it migrated to Washington and wasn't really resolved until Bill Clinton signed the Welfare Reform Act, and then also I believe there were some court cases that found that parts of Proposition 187 were unconstitutional. Yes. But one could imagine that on a national level, that moment would have led to the abandonment of the Republican Party by Latinos. It certainly did in California. I think that's almost universally accepted as a truism about why California turned so relentlessly blue after that. So why do you think that this did not have the kind of national impact on Latino attitudes toward the parties that would be the counterpart of the African American experience in the 1960s?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's it's also like not a super easy one to answer. I mean, I think people have wondered. I think pointing to Proposition 187 and the Republican Party's rightward turn on immigration is the moment that you would try to compare with Republican opposition to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and that would be like a watershed moment. And in some ways, it was, like you said, in California. I have to say that one thing that surprises me about California, even today, is that in the immediate aftermath of Proposition 187, it's true that Hispanic support for Republicans dropped from like 32% to 24, 25%. But to this day, about a quarter of Latinos vote for Republicans, even in the state of California. So it didn't bottom out their support. It hurt it, but it didn't bottom out. And I think this is interesting because a state like California this year has 8 million eligible Latino voters, meaning that about 2 million, if they all vote, will vote for Donald Trump as president. And I think that's interesting when you compare it to a state like Florida, which has seemed to be much more conservative, but has a much smaller Latino population, like of 3.1 million Latinos. And in 2016, 35% of Latinos in Florida voted for Donald Trump. So 35% of 3.1 million is more than a million. My point is that, yes, California is not a swing state, so it's less important, but just in terms of raw numbers, there will be more Latinos in the state of California. So I always think that that's an interesting fact, but it certainly did dampen Hispanic support for the Republican Party. Or let me put it this way. I think the immigration issue and the Republican Party's rightward turn on immigration has forced Hispanic Republicans to work harder to justify their continued support for the Republican Party despite the party's rightward turn. And as a result, Hispanics since the 1990s Hispanic Republicans have said that they care about much more than immigration. They care about healthcare, jobs, education. They're not single voter issues. And in fact, immigration is like fourth or fifth among the issues that they care a lot about. And what I would say about that is that has always been true. Like Latinos have never been single voter issues who only care about immigration, but they've had to insist on that fact louder and more often since the 1990s as the party has moved, So it's always been true that they've cared about more than immigration, but they've had to insist upon that more and more as a way of justifying their continued support. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think it points to some of the reasons why.
Mm-hmm. Let me shift gears a little bit. May I ask a personal question? Personal to me, not to you. So I grew up in
a personal question too.
I grew up in a Latino household in LA. And our background was Mexican and Central American. And I was always struck when I was young by how much of political identification among those communities was what I would call affective. That is to say, it was based on strong feelings of attraction or of incomprehension across lines of Latino identity. In other words, on the one hand, that was the period of the birth of the Chicano movement when I was a kid. I think this week is the 50th anniversary of the Chicano moratorium in Los Angeles. It was a very important, as you know very well, was a very important event that catalyzed the development of the Chicano movement and La Raza Unida, which was, as you say, it was a kind of third party in the late 60s. And that engendered very, very strong feelings at the time and for years afterwards. At the same time, there was a kind of, among the people I grew up with, there was a kind of lack of comprehension, almost lack of interest in the point of view of Miami Cubans, for instance, who seemed like a very different kind of group in so many different ways, with very different worldviews, really. As a historian, this is my question really. As a historian, how do you, or do you capture that kind of affective dimension of political identity? Is it something that a historian can get into a book like yours? Is it something that you know, is there a way to get it into the story? Does it matter to you? And how did you confront it as you're writing a book like this?
Yeah, it's a great question too. And so, but let me just try to clarify a little bit. By affective relationship, do you mean how, you know, someone like you from California comes to develop some sense of connection to or affiliation with a Cuban in Miami, for example?
Yeah, and the fact that strong feeling which can have mysterious sources, can often override shared interests or proximity, and certainly shared language, which is in fact, as you know very well, is quite a thin tissue of identity, you know, holding people together in the Latino community, you know. So yeah, it's a kind of the random factor in political affiliation and identification that it would seem to me would be a very challenging thing for a historian to capture.
Totally. Yeah. And if I may, I know this isn't about you, it's about me answering your question, but I just have to ask, since the place and the period when you grew up is something that I pay some attention to, what area of LA did you grow up in?
Oh, I grew up in the center of LA, right in the middle. I didn't grow up in the barrio. I grew up in the Fairfax area in the middle of LA.
Yeah. Cool. That was just for my curiosity. I mean, I interviewed a lot of guys like Stuart Spencer, who worked for Nixon in 1960, who had a whole like outreach campaign in East Los Angeles by setting up, you know, medical clinics and legal advice, immigration legal advice clinics for Mexican Americans, and, you know, very proudly says that as a result of those efforts, Nixon won like 45% of the Mexican American vote in his Senate campaign of 1960. So anyway, this is a place, and you must remember like Sam Yorty and
Absolutely
those people, you know. Okay, so
Sam Yorty was the mayor of Los Angeles, who was the last prominent politician in California to insist on calling Los Angeles Los Angeles. Was, you know, a thumb in the eye of the Spanish language. Imagine a mayor of Los Angeles calling it Los Angeles.
I know. My partner is from Colorado, and she talks about how very defiantly people call Pueblo Pueblo, and I don't even know how they get there from Pueblo to Pueblo, but you know, the G, at least it can be J or G, but I don't know, Pueblo. But anyway, yeah, those kinds of affective relationships, it takes work, you know, it takes work. But I do think that there are, and that's, you know, I think that's what's behind the effort to try to articulate core issues that cut across nationality groups like Spanish or Catholicism. You know, I teach Latino history at Northwestern, and I've taught that class maybe 6 or 7 times, and we always begin, and in some ways the like main overarching theme throughout the course is who or what is a Latino anyway. And at the beginning I tell them that, you know, as I see it, the issues that cut across all Latino groups are migration, race, labor, and empire. And in one way or another, all of those issues cut across Latino groups. They all have experiences of migration. They all have stories about US Latin American relationships that have to do with, you know, the intervention of the United States and subsequent migration to the United States of Latino populations. They all have racial dynamics. They all have labor dynamics. So, you know, but my point is that that's me naming those things. I'm the one creating that edifice, you know, and I think that that's like what, you know, campaign advisors try to do to the present, but, you know, really began that effort in the 70s, say. So, you know, it's tricky. And, you know, especially when there are many issues like citizenship, where Puerto Ricans are citizens, and they can look down on undocumented immigrants who don't have citizenship, or, you know, Mexican Americans in some ways maintain this idea that Puerto Rico is a kind of overpopulated island with hyper breeders, you know, so that especially when there are those kind of recognize differences between communities. It takes work to do that. You know, I think, how does it happen? I mean, maybe you could tell me a little bit about this because you're both Mexican American and Central American. I mean, I think in particular places where there's intermarriage and the mixture of communities and the incorporation of different Latino groups like Central Americans into a historically Mexican American area, I think that's how, you know, stores open where they share each other's food and all those things.
Yeah, that's
I think affective relationships can happen that way. I think they can happen politically, where in Florida, for example, like to take a wildly different example, the Bay of Pigs veterans trained the Contras in bases in Miami and they had an affective relationship with them because they said, like, we had this experience in the 1960s. You guys are going through the same thing, so we're gonna train you militarily to fight communism in the same way that we did. And now in the same way that, like, Venezuela and Hugo Chavez is a issue of key importance to Cuban Americans. So that's a wildly different issue, but.
Those are great examples, especially the Bay of Pigs example, because that's exactly what I mean, where a shared experience becomes mythologized by one group, and they then look for a place to render it's historical, but they look for a place to render it contemporaneous again, even if there's it's a different group, somewhat different situation, different interests. It carries across. Yeah, that's wonderful.
And I think you heard this in the Republican convention last night when you heard, well, even 2 nights ago, there was this guy, Maximo Alvarez, who, why is it, you might ask, that the Republican Party keeps trotting out Cuban exiles who fled from Castro's Cuba in the 1960s? Why does this issue matter in 2020? And I think that socialism is one of these issues. It comes to stand in for all kinds of things. I mean, socialism can encompass, you know, government control in areas like education, so school choice or financial regulations. It all falls under the rubric of socialism. And we come to think that, I mean, it's wrong to think that when a Hispanic Republican talks about socialism, they're only talking about Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro. There's this whole other range of issues. And I also think it's wrong to think that it's just a message that targets Cubans and Venezuelans, because Puerto Ricans, for example, when they hear the word socialism, they have all of these other experiences of the independence movement on the island and how Luis Ferré was the kind of Republican to beat back the radical socialists. And, you know, you'll remember, maybe not because you lived through it, because you're far too young for that, but the 1950, you know, shooting in Congress by Lolita Lebron, a Puerto Rican nationalist who was labeled in the context of the Cold War as a communist and a socialist. So I think Puerto Ricans, Mexicans have their own version of socialism that cuts across groups. And I guess, you know, maybe those particular issues, and maybe there are others that I'm missing, that create those affective relationships.
Thank you. That's wonderful. That's exactly what I was interested in hearing you talk about. So we have about 15 minutes to go, and I'm going to reserve the last 10 minutes for some sort of present day political questions that a number of people in the audience have asked. But before I do that, I want to ask, with apologies to our non-academic audience, I can't resist asking you a somewhat academic question.
Go ahead.
Which is, when you set out to write this book, what was missing in the existing literature on this topic that made you think, that made you understand the contours of the book as you did, and that made you, to what were you responding, I guess is what I would say.
Sure. You know, I don't think I set out to write this book with a critique of political science as a field. And I don't know that I still don't know that I have like a critique of political science as a field. I think I'm way too inexperienced for that to say. But here's what I will say. I think one insight that history has given me is that I think it helps explain the durability of the Latino vote for Republicans and how it's lasted for way longer than it makes sense to have lasted. Because I think the way that political scientists work with attitude surveys and questions about particular issues, I think, I would love to have this conversation with more of them, but I think it would lead one to believe that, okay, if you tally up these issues like abortion or military service or ideas about federal intervention in the economy, that the results of those surveys, you know, they're like inputs into an equation, and the output would be Republican or Democrat. And I think that that's the way political science works, but it doesn't help to explain this ongoing mystery, which is why the vote has been so durable, even over the past 20 years when the party has moved right. And I know that loyalty is a fuzzy concept, you know, it's a fuzzy concept, loyalty and party loyalty. But to me, it's one of the things that helps explain the inexplicable, you know, how it is. And, you know, maybe I'm placing too much weight on an idea expressed to me by a Hispanic Republican leader today when I was talking to him before the 2016 election. And he said, you know, I might not love Trump. I don't love everything about him, but I'm gonna vote for him because I support the Republican Party, and I'm not gonna let one man ruin the movement that we've built over the course of decades. And to me, it was this party over man logic. They're going to vote for the Republican Party over the individual candidate, Donald Trump. And that was an exact reversal from what happened in 1980, which Reagan's Hispanic advisors, they were trying to convince Hispanics. They're like, look, we know that the Republican Party hasn't always represented your best interests, but here you have the governor of California. He's worked with Latinos. He had appointed more Mexican Americans to his administration than any governor since the 19th century. So vote for this man, not the Republican Party. And so I think in many ways, you know, the historical shift that my book was trying to explain is how this logic from man to party shifted to party over man, you know? And
yeah.
So that's what I think history can help to explain, the kind of long-term durability. And it cuts in different ways. Like, as a historian, I've been taught two things. One has to do with contingency and this idea that just because things have been a certain way for the past 50 years doesn't mean that they're destined to go on like that for the next 50. So there may still come a moment when Latinos have their post-1964 moment and abandon the Republican Party en masse. Maybe it's coronavirus, maybe it's the response to the Black Lives Matter movement. Maybe it'll be this year, maybe it won't. So on the one hand, history teaches us contingency, but on the other hand, as a historian, I can say, look, you know, you might think it makes no sense for 30% of Latinos to continue to support Donald Trump today, but they've done that for the past 50 years. So history can kind of cut both ways in that way.
Okay, all right, thank you. In our last 10 minutes, let me try to get in a couple of questions from the audience. Here's one.
Try to be briefer in my response.
Is there an age difference in current Hispanic Republican support? In other words, are the supporters the older generation, and with the younger generation supporting the Democrats at a higher than 70% rate? If so, is the ratio similar to previous decades, or is this also not monolithic like the other aspects you've discussed?
I mean, I don't know is the short answer. I don't know that anyone knows, because I don't think there are like long range surveys of how Hispanic Republican versus Democratic votes have split. I have not seen it parsed out that way. What I have seen is things like, you know, we know that Latino youth overwhelmingly supported Bernie Sanders against Joe Biden in the Democratic primary, which does suggest that Latino youth favor more liberal positions than older Latinos. That was reflected in the, you know, outcome of the Democratic election. That said, in my interviews, one thing I found so interesting is that it was actually the older Republicans who were wrestling the most with their continued support for Donald Trump, because they grew up in a different Republican Party. And they can recognize these long-term shifts that they felt more included within the Republican Party in the past than they do today. So the people I've interviewed, it's actually been the older people who've told me that they either voted for Hillary Clinton for a Democrat for the first time in 2016. These are people who had voted for Republicans for 40 or 50 years, or that they were going to stay home. It was actually the older people who did that. And, you know, I've interviewed plenty of Cuban youth in Miami who have, especially, I'm really interested in these Catholic girls' schools like the Carrollton School of the Sacred Heart, where they're like 90% Latina, and their parents, by and large, are Latin American immigrants, and they've told me about more or less embracing the politics of their parents. So, you know, I'm not sure. It seems, I guess, maybe as a historian, maybe as someone who, you know, lives in a gray world himself, I'm not sure. I wouldn't say with confidence that as Latino youth grow older, that they won't support Republicans at this same 30% level. I don't know, but.
Any thoughts on the issue of climate change among the different Latino groups or as a collective group?
Not as a collective. Well, I don't, you know, a lot of this, by the way, is that this isn't whatever I tell you is not going to be based on like personal research. This is going to be based on limited reading that I've done. My sense is that Latino activism around climate change has to do with particular places like the red blooms off the coast of Florida and rising sea levels off the coast of Florida that affect you know, Latino areas, or in California, like Latinos living near city dumps or with air pollution. So my sense from climate change's impact on agricultural regions in North Carolina or Texas or something like that. My sense is that Latino activism on climate change has to do with these particular issues in particular places rather than a national movement. But, you know, I think to the extent that we have a national conversation about climate change, I feel like it is something that Americans nationally are increasingly aware of. So I wouldn't be surprised if a national movement grew around it.
And finally, let this be the last question. What have you, this week, during the Republican National Convention, what have you seen from the Republican Convention that relates to what you've written? And then a question from Dublin. Do you think that it's likely that we will ever see a Republican, a Latino Republican presidential candidate?
Well, the second one's easy. I mean, we've already, you mean, I assume you mean like as the party nominee.
I assume that
like,
that's what the,
yeah, to win the nomination. Yeah, because we've had like Ben Fernandez, Marco Rubio, what's the New Mexico guy, Bill Richardson, and Ted Cruz. So we've had it, but yeah, sure, I think so. I think so. You know, there are a lot of relatively young Latinos in the Republican Party. Oh, I forgot to answer your like bigger question about like the long term. You know, I mean, Latinos do just represent a greater and greater share of the American population. And, you know, we've all seen the population estimates about Latinos representing a third of, and right now they're 18% of the American population. They will be, you know, something like a third of the American population by 2050, and the numbers will go up. So, you know, I think that gets back to your first question about identity and will we keep talking about the Latino vote going forward? And no, I mean, maybe not, I don't know, but the greater share of the American population that they represent, maybe that'll just be called the American vote. And, you know, so I don't know that it will be the Hispanic vote forever. So the first question, or the second question, the person from Dublin asked about, will there be a Latino Republican nominee? I would expect so at some point. And the convention, what have I seen? You know, I wasn't at all surprised to see the Cuban exile Maximo Alvarez. I feel like Republicans have trotted out a similar figure over the past 40 years to talk about how You know, he's lived through socialism, understands its evils, and this democratic president will take us down the same path that they experienced in Cuba. That is an old story that frankly, I mean, I guess I was talking to you about how it's still effective as a way of creating these affective ties, but so I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but I'm still surprised that they continue to do that. And then also, you know, here's one thing that I can say too. I think that, and this is more, I think, a warning to Democrats than anything else. You know, there was that week about a month ago where Trump had a kind of onslaught of Hispanic outreach efforts, both at the White House and in Southern Florida, where he signed an executive order, the Hispanic Prosperity Initiative. He traveled to South Florida, met with Venezuelans in a church. He talked to the Southern Command about drug trafficking from South America. And he also, you know, sat for an interview with Telemundo where he said he was going to sign another executive order that would protect the Dreamers and even give them a pathway to citizenship. One thing that happened that week was that, as we know, the CEO of Goya got up and talked about how we're blessed to have Trump as a president. And that kind of carried the news cycle for a week. That comment about Goya, and then there were subsequent calls to boycott Goya. The right, through figures like Dinesh D'Souza, but even Ivanka Trump, seized on that issue as an example of the left's cancel culture. So I think what I worry about is that the liberal response to the Goya controversy ignored these things like what the Hispanic Prosperity Initiative was all about, like investing in charter schools. 1/3 of students in charter schools are Latinos. Trump also announced greater investments in Hispanic serving institutions. He even announced an executive order that would protect Dreamers and give them a pathway to citizenship. He quickly rescinded that, or said he wasn't going to do that. My point is that by going down this like Goya rabbit hole, Democrats lost sight of these particular issues like charter schools or the drug trade or evangelical Venezuelans in Florida. And I think we should be focusing more on them. And I think that what I've seen at the convention this week is that, you know, there's all kinds of message signaling going on from Hispanic Republicans like Jeanette Sanchez last night, that these issues like religious freedom, charter schools, those things matter to Hispanic Republicans, and we've heard it at the convention. And I do wish that Democrats would have an answer about those particular issues instead of just going down the rabbit hole of like canceling Goya. That makes sense. Yeah. That's my thought about right now.
Thank you so much, Jerry. You know, this week of all weeks that we're having this conversation, the last week of August 2020 during the Republican convention, and as we head into the November election, it is so valuable for us to have your insights on these questions. So we appreciate it very much. It's really been a treat to talk to you.
Thank you for having me, Roland, and I miss all of you guys in California. Be well.
Now, to those of you in our audience, let me conclude by inviting you to join us for our next 2 online events from the Stanford Humanities Center. On Wednesday, September 23rd, the historian of Latin America, Jorge Cañizares Esguerra, from the University of Texas, Austin, will inaugurate a new series called How Change Happens, Knowledge and Justice in 2020. Professor Cañizares will share his work in progress and also talk about how his groundbreaking scholarship, archival scholarship on colonial Spanish America prepared him to gather evidence of discrimination against Latino faculty at his university. And on Tuesday, October 20th, the philosopher Achille Mbembe, the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, will deliver the annual presidential lecture in the humanities. All of our events may be found on our website, shc.stanford.edu. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you again, Jerry, and we look forward to seeing you here again.